Hello, it's wonderful to be together. I have to switch to gallery view. There we go. Now I see a few more of you. Hello, everybody. So as Julie said, I am joining you from Israel, and I will name at the outset that I am heavy-hearted, in anticipating this particular class in our series on the 5 Megillot. I was, each of the Megillot we've gathered around so far this year, they're sort of angsty in one way or another, and I'm constantly balancing my teaching of not wanting to be too radical. And with Ruth, I was just imagining something wholesome and lovely, because this is a book that is wholesome and lovely, and instead, of course, outside of my windows, we're not in a place, the world feels more broken than whole. So I am coming to you from the north of Israel, where things are relatively quiet. We didn't have need for bomb shelters last night, but I do hear out my windows some of the unrest. So I'm aware of that, and hopefully it won't weigh too heavily. But I want to bring it into our learning on two layers. The first is that we have a conviction in Judaism that the very act of studying Torah carries power. And so we'll set the intention for our learning that through the Torah that we study together, we're going to be studying the Book of Ruth, Torah in the broadest sense, through the Torah that we're going to study together for the next hour, that we do our part inwardly to cultivate a sense of peace and of honoring for the value of all human life, and that radiates out from each of our hearts outward, and that we in our own small way tip the scales a little bit towards the balance of the celebrating of life and the valuing and respecting of all living beings. So that's the first way. The second way, the truth is that the Book of Ruth has something really powerful to say to us, specifically in the context of the recent unrest. One of the, arguably one of the most significant living thinkers reading and writing right now in Israel is Noah Yuval Harari, and I'm sure some of you have read his work. And so Dr. Harari has a couple of really important insights that he's offering the world, but I think first among them is his conviction that really there's nothing more powerful than story, that what makes human beings different from all other creatures walking the earth is not our opposable thumbs so much as our ability to gather consensus around shared narrative, that it's only by all of us assigning the same value to a piece of metal or a piece of synthetic paper that it becomes money and therefore can create global economies and therefore raise the overall wealth of people far beyond any ability before we had symbolic money. And so too with war and peace. And what these types of conflicts, when I said that I could hear unrest out my window, that I'm far from any border, that unrest out my window is in a part of Israel where I am all the time. 5 minutes from my house, I do all of my normal shopping in an Arab Israeli village, and we live intertwined lives. And then every once in a while, we have these eruptions which make clear that we don't yet have a shared narrative. We don't yet have a way here to tell one singular story that gives enough space for all of the people who call this place home. And so that's what we need. And in a certain way, I want to offer that as our opening question for our learning. What does it look like to redefine narrative, to reimagine story in such a way that it creates more space and more tolerance? That is what the Book of Ruth is about. The Book of Ruth is the story of chesed. Ruth is the embodiment of chesed, of loving kindness. And unlike our other classes on the Megillot, I hope that we're going to do some of this one from the inside. Megillat Ruth is only a lovely 4 chapters. And it's the kind of story that I can read to you and you can get a lot out of it because it's really accessible narrative. I'm probably not going to do much reading aloud for Echa Lamentations, the next class in the series, but this one we can read some of it. And so Ruth, and so we'll hear that the word for chesed, the word for loving kindness, is repeated several times in this Megillah. Ruth is the embodiment of chesed, of loving kindness. The second, and we get that through the telling of story. The second way this story is transformational is that we're going to talk a little bit about authorship of this book, but I'll jump ahead and say that basically the Book of Ruth is complicated for me to teach 94 students of Torah whom I've never met, because I don't know where you all are coming from. And it's one of the books where there's a pretty striking conflict, because we get a clear dating of the book from the book itself. In the opening verses of the book tells us that this is in the time of the judges. And so the rabbis read it and they say, yes, it's the time of the judges, not long after Devorah was ruling in the earliest history of the time that the Jewish people are in the land. We have this story that takes place. Whereas the scholarly consensus is that the book is quite a bit later than that. And I actually, normally I would hesitate to bring a critical read to a group of students whom I don't know. But in this case, I want to bring it because the essence of it, it's about using story to redefine narrative, to make more space for more people. The scholarly consensus is that, and if you had a chance to take a quick look at the source sheet, there's a source, an excerpt from the Jewish Encyclopedia that summarizes this, and I'll share my screen to that in a few minutes. The scholarly consensus about the Book of Ruth is that it's actually coming in response to the polemic that was led by Ezra and Nehemiah. So the very close of the Tanakh, the last books of the Tanakh, the almost last books of the Tanakh, Ezra and Nehemiah, those books, we believe that there's a pretty close alignment between the narratives in those books and actually their entry into the canon, because for the most part, we think that the Tanakh was canonized around the time of the return from the land, where there were arguably historical leaders named Ezra and Nehemiah who were doing something like what those books describe. And so what we read in those books is that part of the reconstituting of the Jewish people when they returned from exile, there was a sense, one would have to assume that there was a certain fear about loss of identity for one reason or another. Ezra and Nehemiah cast the challenge almost in ethnic terms, and they say the sanctity of the Jewish people has been diluted by exile. All you Jewish men are coming back with non-Jewish wives. It's unacceptable. And it would seem from these books that they make efforts, and the books convey the story with a certain sense of emotion. They separate what we might call intermarriages. So now, why am I telling you that? Because scholars believe that the Book of Ruth was pulled together. Perhaps there's a very old layer of the Book of Ruth that was perhaps preserved first as poetry that really might date back much, much earlier, before the time of David. But when the Book of Ruth took the shape that we know, it's because there was a counter voice among the Jewish people that was so in so much disagreement with this move against intermarriage that they penned the Book of Ruth, which is a story of intermarriage par excellence, of a woman who is so clearly good and so clearly the embodiment of what we would call Torah values, that she is just embraced by the community in her return to the land. And so much so that she becomes ancestor of King David, and that's how the book ends. We'll read that together. She becomes ancestor of King David, who is ancestor of the Messiah. And so what we have in the Book of Ruth is a story of, on a certain level, I want to say a non-Jew. Now, of course, from Ruth, we get the very template for conversion, but the book itself doesn't need her to convert. She just does. It's just that her embrace is so total and so loving that it becomes conversion in and of itself par excellence. The affirmation that converts make when they join the Jewish people is taken from this book. but it's not that she goes through an official conversion ritual where she goes to mikvah for us. That's not what happens. Rather, she is, on the face of it, this is a story of a Moabite woman, which is especially problematic. We'll look at that in the verses, who becomes the grandmother of the Messiah. And so that powerful use of narrative to shift perspective in order to take what is we have a biblical prohibition. I'll show this to you as soon as I share my screen. We have a biblical prohibition specifically against Moabites. There's a sense in the Torah that arguably the worst sin that was committed during the time in the wandering of the desert was committed at the hands of Moabite women. So the actual sin itself is pretty shrouded in mystery, but we get a sense of it from Parashat Pinchas. But for one, you can, so that's a little teaser that if you want to keep learning later, you could go open up Parashat Pinchas and say, well, what was she talking about? But you have to go backwards. Parashat Pinchas is only the very end of the story. But what we get from the book of Deuteronomy, and I'll show you this verse when I share my screen, is that whatever happened there was pretty darn bad, so much so that whereas the Torah can tolerate and can have a certain sense of conversion, conversion was very easy in biblical times. You just got married and moved in, and there you were part of the Jewish people. The Torah had a certain sense of that, except for with Moabite women. And with Moabite women, the book of Deuteronomy is very clear. They may not enter. And yet here, it's not just that we have a story of Ruth, a woman who happens to stick it out and come back with Naomi, but rather we have the book makes a clear point that she is Moabite. The book takes it on directly, and it's that woman who becomes the progenitor to the Messiah. So it's a really beautiful act of storytelling. All right, that was quite a meaty intro. So I'm going to pause for a minute. I can see less of you when I open it so that I can read the chat. Any clarifying questions there? We'll take a few questions, and then I'll share my screen and we'll dive into the text itself. So Raymond is asking, are there descendants of the Moabites from Noah when he went with his daughters? So that's a good question. So the end of the story of Noah tells us specifically that that lineages come out from that, but we don't get any, like the line from Abraham to Noah, from Noah to Abraham, we don't get survivors other than knowing Abraham's lineage himself. So I can't tell you about that specifically. Betsy is asking, I thought that the prohibition was against Moabite men, not women. Would you please elucidate? So Betsy, I'll come back to that when I share my screen and I'll show the verse, okay? Because the verse is explicit. Now, just to be clear, we're not going to talk about halakha at all today, or conversion at all, but just to be clear, there's no halachic issue anymore around this. The rabbis basically say, yes, this verse that I'm going to show you, all those women are gone, everyone now is fine, anyone who wants to convert can go through a process of conversion and join the Jewish people, but that was not the case in the time of Ruth. Any other questions? So I'm going to share my screen. You have the link to the source sheet. Julie posted it in the chat. And I'm just sharing from the PDF version. I like it a little bit better. Okay, so let's just look at that verse from Deuteronomy, but then as a little bit of a warm-up, because I talked about it, and then we'll go from there. Okay. So here's the prohibition from the book of Deuteronomy. No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. None of their descendants, even in the 10th generation, shall ever be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. Why? Because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey after you left Egypt, and because they hired Balaam, son of Peor, from Pethor of Aram to curse you. But the Lord your God refused to heed Balaam. Instead, the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you. For the Lord your God loves you. You shall never concern yourself with their welfare or benefit as long as you live. And then it goes on. Okay, everyone else. Okay, you shall not abhor an Adamite, for he is your kinsman. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you were a stranger in his land. Okay. So Betsy, it's possible that there's a halakhic solution that you're aware of that I'm not, that says, oh, this just refers to men, but that's not my understanding of of the pshat there. But it's possible that that's certainly not my area of expertise. Okay, so I want to actually start our text study tonight by just entering the words of the Megillah itself, because it really is so lovely. We're probably not going to be able to read all of it, although I did give us the whole text here on the source sheet. And so if we don't finish it together, then I hope you choose to read the whole thing. But I'm going to read just the first chapter, and we're going to use that as a way to flesh out some of the themes. And we'll look at a little bit. I brought us one or two midrashim here. We'll look a little. Will you let the midrash help us to flesh out some of the themes and take questions, and then we'll go forward from there. All right. So this is the opening of Megillat Ruth. In the days when the chieftains ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah, with his wife and 2 sons, went to reside in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and his 2 sons were named Machlon and Kilion, Ephratites of Bethlehem in Judah. They came to the country of Moab and remained there. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. Then those 2, Machlon and Kilion, also died. So the woman was left without her 2 sons and without her husband. She started out with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab. For in the country of Moab she had heard that the Lord had taken note of his people and had given them food. Accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living, and they set out on the road back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Turn back, each of you, to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt kindly with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that each of you find security in the house of a husband." And she kissed them farewell. They broke into weeping and said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Turn back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I any more sons in my body who might be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to be married. Even if I thought there was hope for me, and even if I were married tonight, and I also bore sons, should you wait for them to grow up? Should you on their account debar yourselves from marriage? Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of the Lord has struck out against me." They broke into weeping again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law farewell. But Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and her gods. Go, follow your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not to follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you." When Naomi saw how determined she was to go with her, she ceased to argue with her, and the 2 went on until they reached Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole city buzzed with excitement over them. The women said, "Can this be Naomi?" "Do not call me Naomi," she said. "Call me Mara, for Shaddai has made my lot very bitter." In Hebrew, Mara is bitter. "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. How can you call me Naomi, when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, when Shaddai has brought me misfortune upon me?" Thus Naomi returned from the country of Moab. She returned with her daughter-in-law Ruth, the Moabite, and they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. I'm going to stop the share for the moment, although I am going to reference 1 or 2 of the midrashim with the screen not shared. So if you want to click into the link, if it's important to you to see them on the inside. Okay. So this is really a moment where I wish that I'm going to throw out some open questions, and I want to encourage you to answer them in the chat, and we'll see if we can read out some answers, or I'm going to be assuming that you're giving me great answers and go forward. But I know that you have already noticed just all kinds of wonderful details, and that if we were to make a list of kushiyot, of questions on the text, that from those questions we could just have a wonderful discussion together. So I'm sure if you have studied from Chumash, from the 5 books of Moses, that the tone of Ruth all of a sudden feels very familiar, much more familiar to us than the tone of some of the books of Nevi'im or other sections of Ketuvim. We almost feel like we're back in the stories of Genesis. What's more than that, the book of Ruth seems to know Torah to a certain extent. I don't know if we're going to have a chance to study chapter 3 together live, but chapter 3 is dedicated to the laws of Leverite marriage, Yibum, and they're already being anticipated here in Naomi's dramatic speech, where she says, no, I'm too old to have more children. Even if I were to get married right now and start having kids, it would just take too long for me to make a son for you. All of that, she's speaking within this context, which is the context of Leverite marriage. That's as a teaser. Maybe we'll come back to that in a little bit. Next, the story here, I wonder, and maybe you can write this into the chat. Does anyone in specific, so we've mentioned legal sections of Torah that are really alive in this book. The verse from Deuteronomy that we looked at, these laws of Levirate marriage that are found in Leviticus. But how about on the narrative side? Any stories from Chumash that are just ringing in our ears from what we read from chapter 1? Thank you. Okay, so Carol with the win. So Carol wrote into the chat Tamar. So the story of Judah and Tamar is also echoing in the background here, and so we've seen that this story is taking place in the land of Judah. Boaz himself, our male hero in the story, is going to be of Judah, and David as the king from Judah, of course, is very is central to him as a political figure. And so the story of Judah and Tamar is echoing in the background here. Now, Judah and Tamar is a radical story in its own right, and a sort of audacious story in its own right, that adds to the richness of the book of Ruth here. But here the Megillat Ruth is almost directly referencing some of the Judah and Tamar story. I can show you that once I share the screen again. They returned to Judah, to their ancestral home Bethlehem. They hope to reclaim the family property. Okay, and I don't know, Josie, what you mean by for Annette, but maybe you're studying with Annette, who gave us that insight. Okay, good. Wonderful. The last piece I want to point out, maybe I'll return the share. Okay, so we could, from studying this first chapter, we could make a list of theme words that were repeated in the first chapter. And what we would notice is that the word name, Shem, is a theme word here. We have it already, like in the beginning introduction. Shem ha'ish Elimelech v'shem ishto Naomi, Shem shnei banav Machlon v'Chilion, Ephraim. Okay, so we have this idea of names as a theme word. And you might say to me, oh, come on, it's opening the story. It's just telling us all the character names. But first of all, not all stories repeat that word name so many times. But if we were unsure, when Naomi comes back, she makes the point explicit to us, or for us. The name Naomi means pleasant. And by the time she's come back, by the time all of this drama has happened to her, she says, do not call me pleasant. Call me bitter, call me bitterness, because the Lord has treated me with bitterness. So we know from her comment that names are play a significant role in this story. And we'll let the Midrash continue to flesh that out for us. But as I navigate back to the Midrash, why am I pointing out specifically that names have important significance? First of all, because this is a beautiful piece of literature and it helps us to value the details in the literature. But what I want us to see from this is how crafted this work is. This is a piece of literature. It's exquisite storytelling with an active storyteller who is investing small detail with meaning. And so, we're studying the book of Ruth in preparation for the holiday of Shavuot. We have all kinds of Shavuot themes that we'll pull out as we go forward in our study. But even on this level of sacred narrative and of exquisitely crafted story, this is a beautiful preparation for Shavuot. We know that Shavuot in its essence is one of the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 pilgrimage festivals. It is a harvest festival. It's marking the major grain harvest in Israel extends from the holiday of Pesach, when the barley harvest begins, and then goes all the way through during the time of the counting of the Omer, and concludes with the holiday of Shavuot and the wheat harvest. And so we'll see themes of the harvest in the second chapter. But the rabbis say that they add a gloss to the meaning of Shavuot. They say that in that 50 days prior, we marked our exodus from Egypt. And we know that what happens following the exodus, the people journey in the desert, and then they gather at Mount Sinai where they receive the Torah. They receive our Jewish people's sacred narrative. And so in that way, the Book of Ruth, it's not a stand-in for the Torah, but it's a symbol. It embodies, it exemplifies the power of sacred narrative as a preparation for us to receive our quintessential sacred narrative in the holiday of Shavuot and receiving of Torah. The last piece I'll say about that, we can see that the Megillat Ruth has a real sense of a just world and reward and punishment. And we've gotten the build up to that in chapter 1, because Naomi has been explicit. This is a really hard fate that this poor woman who the family had to leave home, and we can talk a little bit about immigration. This is a story of immigration and why people move and what happens when one leaves their homeland and integrates with a local population. And she really loses everything there. And so when we meet her and she's introducing herself by saying, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for Shaddai has made my lot very bitter," we're getting the setup to this story that she has fallen really low. And then, of course, by the end of the story, we're going to see that in this particular case, whereas in the world, it is not always that the good are rewarded and the wicked are punished. In this story, that is the case. The good will prevail in a lovely story of happily ever after. Just a quick note, because we're looking at this verse. So El Shaddai is a very ancient name for God. And so we see that that's the name that's being used here. So from Ruth Rabbah, the Midrash pulls out for us the significance of the names. Lots of names have meaning in this book, not just Naomi renaming herself Mara. The man was named Elimelech. Rabbi Meir was interpreting names. Rabbi Yeshua, son of Karkach, was also interpreting names. The man's name was Elimelech. He was saying, "To me, Eli, will come Malchut." His wife's name, meaning as a reference to David HaMelech, who will eventually, be related in a certain way to him. To me, his wife's name was Naomi because her deeds were pleasant, na'im, and pleasing, ne'imim. And his 2 sons were named Machlon and Chilion. Machlon, because they were erased, nimchu, from the world, and chilyon, because they were destroyed, chalu, from the world. So these are very striking names, and they give us a certain sense of foreboding. In an interesting way, they're resonant with Er and Onan. The early figures in the Tamar story also have suspiciously negative names. And when we see from this that something here has gone terribly wrong. The generation that precedes Ruth is lost in a certain way. Now, whether that is a certain kind of, we'll say, nod to the pain of exile, or, we can just say that these names are pregnant with a negative valence, and it adds to the overall weight of the very low place from which this story begins. So let's just pause there for a moment, and if you have questions. I'm noticing, so thank you to Josie for sharing with us that Ruth means friendship. Yes, it does. So Ephratite does not exactly mean that they were the tribe of Ephraim. Rashi speaks to it more like Ephrata. The names all have meanings that foresee the future. So I think, Annette, what you're saying is that the names have foreshadowing in them. Yes, good, which just lovely as a literary technique. So was Elimelech mitznamed since he died in Moab? So Kathleen, that's why I was hesitating a little bit. The Midrash is being very kind to him by saying that that Eli will come malchut, because it's not exactly to him. He dies, his sons dies, but it is true that that chapter 3 will make a big deal about the fact that Boaz is himself a relative and therefore the appropriate redeemer. And so in that way, we'll let Elimelech be part of the story because the story tends to his bloodline. So I mentioned in our introduction that there is a certain, I don't want to show. All right, keep writing. I'm going to ask Julie to keep an eye on the questions, because we can take a few more questions, but I'm going to go back to the share just show you this source from the inside. But we can take a few more questions. So I noted in the introduction that there's a certain tension around the dating of this book, because I thought I gave you that, Midrash. Okay, because the book itself is so clear that it is during the time of the judges, and so you have here that the rabbis have clear consensus. It's just literal, and it happened during the days when the judges judged, during the period before King Shaul reigned, when the generations were administered by judges. This occurred in the days of Yivtzan, as our sages say. Yivtzan is Boaz. So there's real consensus there. Hold on, I lost my train of thought. Why am I telling you this? But when from the critical perspective, on one hand, the Megillat Ruth goes out of its way to show us that it knows the details of the laws of Leverite marriage. It's quite obsessive about those details. I don't think we were going to read this from the inside, so I'll just paraphrase for you, that when it comes time, Ruth and Boaz have met. I was really hoping to look at chapter 2. I'm going to summarize. No, we're going to jump around because I want to do chapter 2 on the inside. So Ruth and Boaz have met. They've decided they want to get married. It's a lovely moonlit scene out in the harvest fields. And then Boaz asks around, and he finds out Okay, I know this woman's story. She was married. They were never able to have a child before her husband died. I know exactly what to do. And he sets out to basically, in ancient terms, convene a Beit Din, and he researches and discovers that there's one other relative who really has more of a right to Ruth. He checks with him. That person has to give up that right, and only then can Boaz marry her. And the story is, he's really showing us what a good Jew he is. The problem is that the Book of Ruth seems to have a different understanding of the laws of Leverite marriage than the ones that we get in Leviticus. And so this is another area where scholars look at this and they raise some questions about the context and the actual relationship of the Book of Ruth to earlier sources. But in that Boaz is so gives such deference to the laws of Levirate marriage, we see that the Elimelech's bloodline stays in there. Okay, Julie, did you see any other questions in the chat that we should tend to before we go forward?
Someone was curious to hear about the name Boaz. Could it be Be'ez with strength, they asked?
It certainly could be, but I can't say like the actual etymology is to say, is that the name? I don't think so, but that's nice. We could certainly midrashically it could be. Okay. All right. So because chapter 2 is really where we just have the themes of Shavuot come alive for us, I want to bring it into our session, and we'll go forward from there. And then here is really where we see this theme of Chesed. This is the Megillat Chesed. The Megillat. It's really it's really the book that most champions loving kindness. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a man of substance of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, I would like to go to the fields and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone who may show me kindness. So this is another place where Megillat Ruth is really, it knows the laws of Torah. You know, we have a specific prohibition or specific instructions in Leviticus. This is the essence of holiness. One of the essential expressions of what it means to be holy is that when you're harvesting, you leave the fallen grain for the poor. And so Ruth wants to go take advantage of that. Perhaps someone may show me kindness, just as she has shown such kindness to Naomi. Yes, daughter, go, she replied, and off she went. She came and gleaned in a field behind the reapers, and as luck would have it, it was the piece of land belonging to Boaz, who was of Elimelech's family. So we can see here in this, just the way that narrative is so lovely, that we have this sense where we start, the story starts in a very low place, and a woman who is righteous, and a family who is just trying to make it in the world, has such hardship befall it, and comes back with nothing. And then here, little by little, coincidences begin to conspire to bring blessing and hope and goodness. So even though Naomi had told Ruth about Boaz, it just so happened she coincidentally finds himself in her field, in his field. Presently Boaz arrived from Bethlehem. He greeted the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they responded, "The Lord bless you." Boaz said to the servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose girl is that?" The servant in charge of the reapers said, "She is a Moabite girl who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." So if we were unsure about the prohibition around Moabite women, this is one of the verses that I was referring to. The text is not bashful about this. It could have easily said, "Oh, she is an Eshet Chesed who has not left the side of her mother-in-law," but it doesn't. It says twice, "She is Moavi from Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. She has been on her feet ever since she came this morning. She has rested but little in the hut." Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen to me, daughter. Don't go to glean in another field. Don't go elsewhere, but stay here close to my girls. Keep your eyes on the field that they are reaping and follow them. I have ordered the men not to bother you. And when you are thirsty, go to the jars and drink some of the water that the men have drawn." She prostrated herself with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why are you so kind to single me out?" When I am a foreigner. Boaz said in reply, "I have been told of all that you did for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in the land of your birth and came to a people you had not known before. May the Lord reward your deeds. May you have a full recompense from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have sought refuge." So I'm just going to pause on that verse to highlight, isn't this what we most want Judaism to be, right? When we think about our tradition at its best, this is what we want it to be. We want it to be good people recognizing good deeds in a way that, as Boaz says, may the Lord reward your deeds. And so here we're seeing that play out, in the most ideal sense, that the reward that is coming from God is coming through Boaz taking notice and showing kindness. She answered, "You are most kind, my lord, to comfort me and to speak gently to your maidservant, though I am not so much as one of your maidservants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here and partake of the meal, and dip your morsel in the vinegar." So she sat down beside the reapers. He handed her roasted grain, and she ate her fill and had some left over. When she got up again to glean, Boaz gave orders to his workers. "You are not only to let her glean among the sheaves without interference, but you must also pull some stalks out of the heaps and leave them for her to glean, and not scold her." She gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned. It was about an ephah of barley, and carried it back with her to the town. When her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, when she took it out and gave her what she had left over after eating her fill, her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be he who took such generous notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law whom she had worked with, saying, "The name of the man with whom I worked today is Boaz." Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he of the Lord, who has not failed in God's kindness to the living or the dead." For Naomi explained to her daughter-in-law, "This man is related to us. He is one of our redeeming kinsmen." Ruth the Moabite said, "He even told me, 'Stay close by my workers until all of my harvest is finished.'" And Naomi answered her daughter-in-law Ruth, "It is best, daughter, that you go out with his girls and not be annoyed in some other field." So she stayed close to the maidservants of Boaz and gleaned until the barley harvest and the wheat harvest were finished. Then she stayed at home with her mother-in-law. So we see from this that we are exactly in this time of year, right where we find ourselves tonight reading right now, this time of the wheat and barley harvest, and this beautiful story of, first of all, of Jews living out Torah in the land, and of good people taking care of one another. I'd love to hear from you thoughts or comments or questions. So Jennifer is asking, is there significance that Boaz returns from Bethlehem of all places? So Jennifer, that's a question that it depends on the perspective from which we're studying the text. I can say that as a student of Critical Bible, which I am a student of Critical Bible, so if we take the later dating of Ruth, the understanding that the book was written far after the reign of King David, then absolutely yes. Every detail of the book is serving to establish and legitimize David as king in Israel, and Judah as the authentic center of the Jewish people. And so yes, not incidental. If you're referring to Jesus, I mean, is it significant because of Jesus? So no, although if you ask a Christian, they will say definitely yes. What I would say as a Jewish scholar of Bible, student of Bible and scholar of Bible, is that it goes the other way, that Jesus is associated with Bethlehem, is yeah, it goes back to the Davidic associations of Bethlehem. What's very, very interesting, though, and this was related because we started the class with me telling you a little bit about the geography where I'm speaking to you from. What's really interesting is that, so I live on the same latitude as the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, where Christian tradition says that Jesus walked on water. We know that many, many Jesus stories take place right here. I do my supermarket shopping in Nazareth. And very, very close to me on the same latitude is an area called Bethlehem of the Galilee. So what's really interesting is that if there is some truth to Jesus and Bethlehem, it's probably this Bethlehem up here. Whereas the Davidic Bethlehem in the Book of Ruth is what we call Bethlehem today, which is now on the other side of the Green Line, very, very close to Efrat. Okay. In terms of names, Bethlehem does mean house of bread. And so I think, Carol, what you're implying there is we have these themes of sustenance, and the reason that Naomi's family had to leave Israel in the first place was because they were starving, and now they're returning to this sense of sustenance. And so that's really nice. That's really nice. So I see that Raymond is just sharing with us that there's a collaboration between Leket and My Jewish Learning, and that's awesome. And Julie, if there's some sort of like tzedakah plug that we can put in at the end, Leket is a fantastic Jewish organization based exactly on this imagery that we were just reading from Megillot's Ruth, but they do this in really proactive ways with all kinds of Jewish businesses where they make it their commitment to not let any food go to waste. And they work both with fields and with hotels, matching up leftovers with hungry people. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. I'm going to read out this question, and then we'll do a tiny bit more. We'll close out the book together. Do the rabbis or Midrash ever look at the individual psychology? I've met women who prefer their mother-in-law to their mother. There are also people who are attracted to strong community aspects of Judaism as well as the values. So, Carol, we have such active carols tonight. The carols I keep calling out are different carols, one from the next. So, Carol, do the rabbis look at psychology? Not as such, but they anticipate psychology. And what's so fun about that question is that one of my favorite current teachers of Torah is the scholar Aviva Zornberg, and nobody does rabbinic psychology like Aviva Zornberg. The breadth of her knowledge is unbelievable. And so she has put out commentaries on several of the individual books of Torah, and then she switched, and now she's doing thematic works which do relate to some books not from the Chumash. And so what she shows there is that Julie, we put in the chat, Aviva Zornberg. What she shows there is that the rabbis are doing psychology. They just don't know to call it that. And that really, when we look at Freud through that perspective, Freud is coming out of a tradition, a cultural milieu that knows that people are multifaceted, that, for example, some of the oldest examples of dream interpretation that we have in all the corpus of recorded human history come from Torah. And so just on that simple layer that the Torah knew that dreams could have symbolic interpretive meaning, and that we could have a hero in Joseph who was an interpreter of dreams. So the rabbis in a certain way are doing psychology. They just they don't know to call it that. Awesome. So someone just posted a recommendation for a Rita Zornberg lecture that maybe you can still find because it just happened through Safaria. Okay, so because we've talked about the foreshadowing of the Messiah in this book, that's where I'd like us to end. So we're gonna I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to read from the 4th chapter. We'll skip over the 3rd, which is the details around Leverite marriage that I was speaking to earlier. I'm just going to take a quick glance at my notes. Okay, no, I think we've done good work here. All right, I'm going to share my screen, and we will enjoy the story coming together. I'm skipping the courtship if I skip to 4. All right. No, and I'm sorry, the Leverite stuff. All right, so let's do a little bit from 3, because that's the courtship, and then we'll skip over the first half of 4, which is the Leverite stuff, and we'll just do the closeout. All right. So we'll just do the beginning of 3. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "Daughter, I must seek a home from you where you may be happy. Now there is our kinsman Boaz, whose girls you were close to. He will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor tonight. So bathe, anoint yourself, dress up, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not disclose yourself to the man until he has finished eating and drinking." So Naomi is going to set up this whole courtship ritual, which is going to go according to her plans. We find Ruth on the threshing floor. The value of this, of seeing this imagery here, is for us to see that the harvest festivals themselves were glorious occasions. You know, in our modern context, we'll arrive on Sunday night at Shavuot, and it will really be a holiday that's emphasizing the dimension of Shavuot that is about receiving the Torah. But there's something lovely about the harvest festival aspects of the regalim, and you know, the specifically celebrating Shavuot as a harvest festival is something that the kibbutz movement in the modern state of Israel recaptured. And so you know, when we celebrate here on the kibbutz on Sunday afternoon, we'll do all kinds of harvesty things with flower wreaths and tractors and whatnot. And then we'll move into our all-night Torah study. Okay, so Ruth and Boaz connect. He declares that he wants to marry her. He gathers a Beit Din. He goes. The process happens with Ploni. Incidentally, this is where we get the name Ploni that the Talmud uses for our own John Smith neutral name comes from here. "You are witness today that I am acquiring from Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Kichlon and Machlon. I am also acquiring Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Machlon, as my wife, so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate, that the name of the deceased may not disappear from among his kinsmen and from the gate of his hometown." I'm sorry to pause. That's what I was going to say earlier. So what the laws of Leverite marriage come down to is this basic sense that there is a potential in every union that must be realized in the form of carrying on the genetic line. And whereas the Torah knows a great deal about fertility and infertility and is comfortable in the area of those topics, it has a deep commitment to the carrying on of a family line. And so that is what the laws of Levirate marriage are about. Now, in the Torah itself, the rules come more, they play out more the way we see them in the story of Judah and Tamar among brothers. There isn't a sense that you have to go searching through all kinds of other kinsmen. We get that only here from this book. So that the name of the deceased may not disappear from among his kinsmen and from the gate of his hometown. You are witness today. All the people at the gate and the elders answered, "We are. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built up the house of Israel, prosperous in Ephrata, and perpetuate your name in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman." So here we see in just a few psukim first of all the entire lineage. And again, if we were reading this book from a political perspective, we would see the politics in this. There's politics in mentioning both Rachel and Leah, because the two are mothers of different tribes in Israel, and the project here is about uniting and having Israel move forward as one people. And then this is the only place where we get a mentioning of Perez, of Judah, Tamar, and Perez. specifically here. So Boaz married Ruth. She became his wife, and she cohabitated, and he cohabitated with her. The Lord let her conceive, and she bore a son. And the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not withheld a redeemer from you today. May his name be perpetuated in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain your old age, for he is born of your daughter-in-law who loves you, and who is better to you than 7 sons." Naomi took the child and held it to her bosom. She became its foster mother. And the woman neighbors gave him a name, saying, "A son is born to Naomi." They named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This is the line of Perez. Perez begot Hetzron, Hetzron begot Ram, Ram begot, this line connecting, making a clear connection all the way from Judah and Tamar to Jesse, who is the father of David, the father of 7 sons, of which David is the youngest. And Jewish tradition teaches us, of course, that that the Messiah, the Messianic line, will come from this line. All right. So, okay. Betsy, okay. So we're going to close with that. I again want to, first of all, wish all of you a meaningful Shavuot. I hope, it's been a great pleasure to teach you this class from Israel. We make, every time we gather for Jewish prayer and we take up the Torah, we make a radical statement. Whereas in a certain way, on the holiday of Shavuot, we look back in Jewish history and we remember that the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. What we sing in our prayers again and again about the Torah, we say, Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, that the Torah in present tense is ever coming out of Zion. And so it's been a lot of fun to teach you this class from the land of Israel. And I hope that on Shavuot, that I hope you choose to participate in the really lovely Jewish tradition that is the tradition to stay up all night studying. I'm sure my Jewish learning has great things in store for you. And that you in some way have that felt sense of experiencing Torah being revealed in real time. And what that translates to is the experience of sacred narrative that is inspiring. And that was the intention that we set today, that this sacred narrative is a story that is about love prevailing over all, and care and happy endings. And so too now for all of the brokenness in the world, may our Torah study help us to move the world to a place where we know how to see people when they are in need and how to open our hearts from a place of chesed, and in that way make the world a more tolerant and more loving place. So we will leave it there.